more to think of.
Like, how do you make it hard? No, I want to see. I want to see someone dress up as a
All right, well, good evening. Welcome to the evening performance of science seminars here at Latino University. And I congratulate you all on coming out on a Friday night to learn more about anthropology and climate change, while all of other people are wasting their time going to Walmart. Concerts. Yeah, concerts, right. Having fun. You want to do that kind of stuff, right? Oh, but there's always tomorrow to have fun with the homework, right? So tonight, it's nice to do things in the evening, maybe a little bit more relaxed or less formal. We have with us tonight Sara Alexander, and she's from Baylor. She's an associate professor of anthropology. Interesting to know that she has her bachelor's degree in German. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? And when we were having dinner, she told us a little bit about how she spent some time in Germany when her father was working on his degree over there. And Dr. Ball had also spent some time in Germany, so they could reminisce, remember all these German things, stuff like that. And she got a degree in German and foreign service from Baylor. And you can see from her life's work that she's still involved in foreign service, but not in a diplomatic sort of way, but in a scientific sort of way. She got a master's in applied social anthropology from the University of Kentucky, and she has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Kentucky. And she's been at Baylor for a long time. She was chair of the Department of Anthropology for a good long time, and she likes to focus on anthropology that affects developing cultures and countries, and how that anthropology is influenced by climate change and things like this. And I think you'll find it to be a very interesting sort of talk, and something that's certainly within the mission of what we do here at Laterno with respect to the movers of men as well as movers of mountains. And I'm just going to tell you more about that. So let's give a warm welcome to Sara Alexander.
I appreciate all of you being here. I think it's particularly challenging on a Friday night to get an audience. I'm also in charge of some lecture series at Baylor, so I think Friday night would be particularly challenging. So I appreciate all of you sitting here. Let me just tell you a little bit, let me add to what we said. There's nothing that's on my webpage that might help you kind of understand who I am and where I'm coming from. So, yes, my graduate degrees are in what's called applied social anthropology. I don't know if anybody knows anything about anthropology, but technically what that means is that my background is largely in what we call cultural anthropology, which you may have been exposed to in things like different stories in National Geographic, right? So cultural anthropologists typically go to different places in the world, mostly non-industrial places, but in today's world, not exclusively so, and document, inventory, all the cultural traits of a particular group. Okay? This is the traditional cultural anthropology. And so that's what my background is in. I sort of know how to do that. I have done it in some cases. But in today's world, guess what? There's no groups that anthropologists haven't documented in such a way. And so there's still studies done in cultural anthropology, but they're typically a little more specific. And so they're focusing on maybe, in my case, really what I am is an environmental anthropologist. Okay? So I'm focusing most of my research on the human dimensions of different environmental problems and issues, because I'm also an applied anthropologist. So what that means is I'm using the sort of traditional cultural anthropological knowledge, even like about religious beliefs, about marriage customs, about social organization, political organization, types of exchange systems. I may be using all that information to try to help facilitate answers to or help address contemporary problems and issues in our world today. So when I was a graduate student at Kentucky, major basketball, right? My initial training was actually in eastern Kentucky on a natural resource management project that had to do with a particular area, a U.S. geological area, that was quite rich in pretty unique formations. This area had over 100 natural sandstone arches. It had, I don't know how many rocks. It was very rich in terms of archaeological data as well. But it's plopped down in the middle of eastern Kentucky, Appalachia, where the people who actually live there have been living there for many, many generations, typically hundreds of years, on the exact same piece of land. And because of this area and its attributes, the U.S. government, as well as the National Forest Service, wanted to protect this area, which meant the local resident populations may or may not be able to stay. Okay? And so that was my first learning opportunity, because as an undergraduate, I was also an environmental studies minor, and I actually found anthropology very late, so I was an anthropology minor. And I was a major kind of environmental kid, and I was like, yay, Sierra Club, yay, Audubon, yay, National Wildlife Federation, or World Wildlife Federation, some of you have heard of them. Yay, 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 we need to protect, we need to conserve. But at that time in my life, I hadn't really thought about the impacts that that might have on people, and on people who might be living in these areas, either within a protected area in this case, or adjacent to it, okay? And so, all of a sudden, I'm plopped down in eastern rural Kentucky, and people are screaming and yelling at each other, and they're also screaming and yelling at the Forest Service, because they do not want a very high level of protected status on that geological area, because it means they either are going to have to move, and this land has been in their family for generations, or they're not going to be able to do certain things on their land, like farming tobacco, which in that time was what they were doing, or raising cattle. So this was my training ground. And I learned, as an applied anthropologist, taking sort of cultural elements. What's the cultural lifeway of how people were living in this particular area of Appalachia? What was their worldview? What were their religious beliefs? What was important to them in their lives, like the sense of place, the value of land. For me, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I have no value of land, basically. I can intellectualize that and say, yes, I can understand that some people might have a very deep attachment to a certain place, but I personally don't have that, you know? And so and these people were very intensely opposed to that. And even the Sierra Club, who I had thought were heroes, Audubon, all these other environmental organizations, were going in and basically prioritizing the protection of that area and not considering the local population. Okay? And so my professor's job, and so I was sort of tagging along learning, was to reach some kind of compromise with all these different groups, including the Forest Service themselves, the local residents. He also wrote the environmental impact statement for the plan. Okay, so he was hired as a consultant to do that as an anthropologist. Okay. And so we came up with over 2 or 3 year period of being there. And I was responsible for interviewing residents. I sort of learned how to do that. There was a significant wilderness recreation population also visiting this area because there's major rock climbing there, canoeing, fishing, hiking, camping. And so I was interviewing or doing a survey with recreationists. So I also learned how to construct surveys and administer them in a wilderness area. What could be more fun than hiking and surveying? You know, your job is that you have to hike. Some of you might enjoy that, right? I had to canoe. I was paid to canoe, so that's kind of fun. And so over time, we were called, and I was, you know, in a training situation to try to come up with ways to have this protective status, because it's a quite unique geological area, that would still allow the resident populations to feel good about it and to also be able to do on the vast majority of their land what they needed or wanted to do. Okay? And so it's a socially and a culturally appropriate approach to trying to address, in this case, some issue that had a very strong environmental component. Okay? So I'm an environmental anthropologist. I'm also what do we call a development anthropologist. And that's more what I'm going to talk about this evening. I do the vast majority of my research and my work in developing countries. Okay? And in anthropology, if anybody wants to pursue anthropology at the doctorate level, typically, you have to choose, you have to have 2 what we call culture areas. These are basically regions of the world that are culturally similar. Okay? And so in our training, we have to specialize, quote unquote, in 2 culture areas, as well as in applied, you have to specialize in these topical areas, like for me, development and environment. Okay? So, you know, some things just kind of happen, right, in your lives. Have you had things just kind of happen? Like decisions, you're not necessarily actively making decisions, things just kind of happen. Like, I don't know how you came to be here. Maybe just kind of things fell into place and it wasn't an active choice. So, as things happen in my life, my first opportunity to have training in a developing country was in Honduras. So everybody know where Honduras is? Central America? Yeah. Okay. So yes, I went on this project. It was an agricultural development, food security kind of project, and learned a lot about nutritional anthropology, farming, agricultural development, and as a result, became pretty interested in Central America. So that's one of my culture areas, and you're going to hear about a project in Belize tonight. But I also happened to, on the personal side of my life, meet my husband when I was in grad school. A lot of you might meet your future spouse when you're in school too. And he happens to be from West Africa. He happens to be from both Mali and Niger, because his father's from Mali, his mother's from Niger. And he grew up in Timbuktu. When he told me that, I thought it was a line. I was like, right, there's not really Timbuktu. But guess what? There really is. And the reason I'm telling you any of this is because we have spent some time there, we have lived there, and as a consequence, from kind of personally derived reasons, my second culture area is West Africa. It's not typical. I won't say it's not normal. It's not typical to have somewhat disparate culture areas, right? Because normally if you're an expert in Central America, then people are going to guess that you're probably an expert in North or Latin America, right? But I sort of have 2 very different regions of the world as my culture areas, and as a result of that, I've also been asked to do work all over Africa. So my special area, and I know more about West Africa, but I have also done some work on things like cultural factors that impact HIV/AIDS, HIV transmission and AIDS in eastern and southern regions of Africa, just as a result of just things flow in our lives. Okay? Today, or tonight, what I'd like to talk about more is my role is kind of combining both the development part of my research with the environmental. As most of you know, topics, issues around climate change, we've all been hearing about them more and more frequently over, for myself, probably the last 15 years, for you, maybe the last 5 or 8 years. And there's been a significant amount of research that's being done by social scientists, not just anthropologists, in many different topical areas and asking many different kinds of questions about climate change. And so I became interested, just given my environmental interests in general, and in the mid-2000s did secure funding from NOAA to conduct research, which is a lot of what you're going to hear about here, looking at some issues around climate change, and really in Belize and the Yucatan of Mexico, but in the interest of time and condensing, I'm focusing this evening on the Belize data. Okay? So what I want to do first is just some general comments, and then I'll show you the questions. I'm just going to give you a really short glimpse into Bangladesh. And I put that in this presentation because Bangladesh is predicted to have, of every single country in the world, the most serious consequences as a result of climate change. And so I thought I'd just show you a little bit of that, and then we'll focus on the roots. So that's kind of where we're going. So, some general introduction. You know, I don't know if you've had much in your coursework about developing countries in general. There's a lot of different characteristics that help describe a developing country, but one of the ones that's typically in the forefront of people's minds is poverty. So yes, many of these developing countries have relatively high rates of poverty. But the Millennium Development Goals, have you ever heard of those? Anybody? MDGs? Yes? So the United Nations in the late 1990s defined by, I mean, it wasn't an overnight process. There's 8 major Millennium Development Goals, and then there's a lot of sub-goals and other goals. And the target period for these goals to be achieved was they would begin projects and programming in 2000, and then there was a major benchmark of 2015, which of course has just happened. And the first goal has to do with poverty. And they want to basically eradicate poverty, which hasn't happened. But they have been able to, in our world today, not just the UN, but a lot of different organizations, agencies, national governments working together to cut in half the amount of people who are suffering from what we call abject poverty. Okay? Abject poverty is where people are living on either $1 or $2 a day. There's 2 different kind of gradations there. In my mind here, I'm saying $2 a day. But this is showing you the percent of people in the world, different poverty levels. This is roughly 10 years ago, so this is kind of not exactly their starting point, but it is showing you the distribution sort of 5 years in. And in the grander scheme of things, in addressing something like poverty, it's not something that you do very quickly. Okay, so this is not quite baseline data, but it's almost baseline data. And you can still see here that poverty is quite widespread. The darker bars are showing you, relative to these incomes, can you guys see that, who is below the poverty line. So in every single country in our world, every country has a quote-unquote poverty line. And that is determined by whether basic human, at what point, at what level of income basic human needs can be met, typically for a family of 4 in that country. And then they economists, etc., figure that out for each country relative to cost of living and standard of living, desired standard of living, and then they set a poverty line. Does anybody know what it is for the U.S.? Anybody have one guess?
$5 a day.
Okay, well, I don't know by day. I actually don't know by day. I know it by year. Year for a family of 4. Anybody care to venture a guess?
14 grand?
No, a little higher.
40,000?
Less.
21.
21 is warm. Who's 21? Okay, you're getting hot. 24,000. 24,000. Okay, so here's a little bit more about poverty levels. You can see this again over the left is showing you the world, and this is showing you everything excluding China. China is not necessarily an outlier, but it does skew the data. And so you can see that for all the different amounts, it's just showing you here $1 to $2.50 a day over this time period, that yes, it is going down. So progress is being made. But in some countries, this is showing you global, okay? And so progress is being made. In some countries, the poverty levels, you still have, in some countries, 45–50% of the population living below the poverty line. And one of the questions I want to ask, have you think about, is whether climate change is a serious risk to trying to reduce poverty. So I have no idea how you guys feel about climate change, but I just thought I'd tell you that I do believe it is happening. I think the bigger questions, or some people might think that weather patterns are changing, but not necessarily is the climate changing over the longer term. And there's a lot of discussion about whether it's what the causal factors are and how much is perhaps human derived. But for purposes of this talk, we're going to say that human activities are contributing, that over the last 100 years, surface temperatures have increased. There's a lot of data to show that, and it's having, significant impacts as a result of that. And some of the most notable changes, I think you've probably heard of all of these through the press or social media, etc., that we're going to have sea level rise, right? It's not going to rise everywhere the same amount. That's kind of interesting to think about, but it's going to happen. We're having already some shifts in climatic zones, so that how weather is playing out in certain places is changing. And, let me just put this bug in your ear. A lot of people go, oh my gosh, things are going bad. But I just got back from my own national meetings, and I heard papers that were about the opportunities of climate change. Okay, so there are some ways in certain places to go, oh, maybe we can do this, and actually it's a good thing. Changes in precipitation patterns, you'll see that in my example in Belize in just a minute. And then I think what maybe comes to our minds in general when we talk about climate change are some extreme weather events, right? A couple years ago, we had over 1,000 tornadoes in the United States. It was the most recorded number of tornadoes in a single calendar year in something like 22 years. Do you remember that? Hearing about a lot of tornadoes? And maybe you're a little away from, Waco is in a tornado alley. I don't know about here, maybe you're a little east of it. But still, they're all over the place, and they're in places, or they're occurring in our country, in many cases, in places where they have never occurred. My sister lives in Connecticut. She didn't move there to escape tornadoes, but she told me one of the things she likes about living in Connecticut is that there are no tornadoes, because she kind of freaks out during tornadoes. And then now she lives in a place where there are tornadoes. Okay, so some pretty different kinds of weather patterns are happening. Okay, I'm guessing you've seen something like this, right? This is over a much longer period of time. It's showing you average surface temperatures, basically for the Earth, and the forecast. Let me see if I can find the red dot. There. Ooh! Okay, that caused major change, not climate change, but major change. I think this might be a little sensitive and touch. Okay, so I'm not going to use that too often, but you see it there on the right? So those are the predictions. I'm guessing that's nothing new for you. But you can see some of the fluctuations over time too. This one is showing you similar thing, only the projections, the different projections and the scenarios. I don't have all those right here for you, but just to suggest to you that there are some different scenarios, and so the projections may impact different areas of the world in very different ways relative to what happens sort of, what should we say, on the ground, so to speak. And here are some of the more, we call them climate-related, like say, events here. We call them climate-related shocks. Some of these are what we would term natural disasters. Others are a shock or an event. Almost all of these that you see here are associated with the phenomenon that we call a one-off disaster. So it's something that happens. There's a pre and a post. It's not a chronic situation necessarily. Most of these, perhaps the flooding and the monsoons are an exception to that. And in my Belize example, mostly what we're dealing with are what's on the left, the hurricanes, some mudslides, and some flooding over here too. That's what they're mostly dealing with in terms of these kind of climate shocks. So, this stuff plays out in different places in our world in very different ways, okay? And so how is climate change impacting developing countries relative to ourselves? Well, I'm really just going to focus on the developing countries, but we have some areas of our world. I've done some work in Nepal, China, the Andes, Peru, Bolivia, where you have melting glaciers that are causing things like increases in flood risk. In some cases, the melting glacier patterns in Nepal are actually having ramifications in Bangladesh and in Burma in terms of both flooding and changing some characteristics of the monsoon season. Okay? So basically, melting glaciers are threatening about 1/6 of the world's population. Has anybody seen the movie Chasing Ice? Make a note of that. It's a documentary. I think some of you might enjoy it. It's not really about, specifically about developing countries, but it's a documentary where this guy, I can't think of his name right now. You could Google it and it'd come up. I think he got National Geographic funding to do this. He set out something like 50 or 60, 75 cameras. In fact, it was a challenge to figure out how to stabilize and secure these cameras. In Iceland, Greenland, all over the Arctic area of Canada, I'm not sure where else. And they're on, I'm not a fancy photographer, but they're on some kind of time sequence, and he's going every month and checking these cameras. And they're literally over the course of, I believe it's roughly a year or two, filming the melting of the ice. And it's incredible footage. It is incredible footage. I think some of you might really enjoy that. And I think you can get that on Amazon for less than $10. Okay. What are we going to have in developing countries? We're going to have declining crop yields. Okay. In many developing countries, you still have population 50 to 60, 70% are still working in agriculture. They are what we call small-scale farmers. Okay? It's like the U.S. roughly 70, 80 years ago. Today, less than 2% of the population in the United States are farmers, okay? In these countries, in many of them, these are generalizations tonight, but in many of them, like I said, 50, 70% are still farming, and they're still dependent on that. Part of what they're growing is food crops, and yes, part is cash crops, okay? And so declining yields are going to leave a whole lot of people without the return to have the purchasing power to then buy food, perhaps have to buy good water, potable water, and everything else, shelter, health care, etc., just the basic needs. When you have people who don't have enough food chronically, they can become undernourished or malnourished. And people who are under or malnourished for extended periods of time, that impacts their immune system. And so they can contract an illness that typically wouldn't be serious, and it becomes serious. In some cases, it's fatal, okay, because of this weakened immune system. So you have increases in deaths due to malnutrition that normally wouldn't be happening. Associated with that, you have vector-borne diseases that become more widespread, that are associated with things like standing water. And now you have melting glaciers, you have standing water. In areas where you may have had that, but now you have more of it, and so you have more increases in things like the malarial mosquito populations, okay? And in these developing countries, if you or I travel to one of those countries, typically we might take a preventive, right, to help us try to keep from having malaria. But on $1 or $2 a day, the cost of that med in country is oftentimes prohibitive. So people in those countries are not taking those meds in a preventive fashion, except for perhaps the people who are wealthier in the elite classes. Okay, they hopefully can access it if they actually get malaria, because that's the med that you would take. But as a result, vector-borne diseases become. The rising sea levels I've mentioned, displacement. Okay, given the monsoons, given the flooding, given mudslides, given at least the immediate aftermath of hurricanes, etc., you have people moving around all over the place. And sometimes they're what we call IDPs, internally displaced people, which means they're staying in country. So in a lot of ways that's good, because their norms for their own lives and what they want, need in their life ways, there's a chance that it can be met because they're in country. But when they become refugees, that's a term that we use when you go out of your own country, that can be way more distressing, okay? By 2050, the projection is that 200 million people may be permanently displaced due to rising sea levels. I show film in one of my classes where a people group that's currently on a smaller island in the Polynesian area is out. The film is detailing them shopping for a new home, because they literally every year see their island becoming smaller and smaller due to sea level rise. And pretty soon there's not going to be an island. And so they're literally, the film shows, it's a National Geographic film, it shows them going to Papua New Guinea, all the way down to New Zealand, to parts of Australia, literally sort of knocking, they're not knocking on doors literally, but they're going and visiting with mayors and village councils, and typically smaller towns or villages, because these people don't want to live in a large city. There's no way they could adjust to that very easily. And these villages, these towns are turning them away. So they're going to be, the whole society is going to be homeless. And then if we have some ecologists in the room, anybody? I don't know your backgrounds. We are losing species right and left due to climate change, because either all these different abiotic factors, species are their range of tolerance is definitely being challenged. And some, yes, are adjusting and adapting and migrating, and others are not. Okay, so what are some more specific things that are happening to the poorer populations in developing countries? Well, they have a decline in their own access to drinking water. Maybe because there's less drinking water and people are fighting over it because there's less. Loss of land mass, I've talked about that. Threatened food securities in many of these countries. That's partially due to the agricultural production issue, but it's also due to the fact that in some places people are not able to maintain their livelihoods for other reasons. They may be dependent on a particular resource that's also being threatened through climate change. They aren't necessarily farmers. And over time, they don't have the purchasing power to buy the food. Declines in crop yields, I've already said. And then also the conditions of a poor diet or not having potable water to drink. If you don't have drinking water and you're drinking out of a water source that in some way has some kind of contamination, which in many of these countries they do, because there's not regulations for dumping in rivers or lakes, or if there is, there's not enforcement of that regulation. Okay? So I'm not going to go through all of this, but just generally, the left three columns are showing you in the 1990s some summaries about climate events and impacts, and then the right three columns, so showing you the events, number of people who were actually killed, and then those who were affected, meaning they weren't killed, but they either lost loved ones, they lost their homes, they became ill. And so look at the Western Pacific. What was going on there, do you think, that happened in the 2000s?
Tsunami.
Yeah. So that's documenting some of the impacts of the tsunami. You can see the total events, roughly, I mean, in a similar range there, right? And one of the things I like to draw your attention to is, apart from Eastern Europe, well, there's some exceptions here, but the developed country numbers in terms of killed and affected is generally much, well, no, I can't say that completely. Well, I can say it in terms of Africa and Southeast Asia and Western Pacific is much lower. So the areas that have a much higher intensity of vulnerability have a lot more people who actually die in these climate-related events and or who are impacted. So here's a map that shows you similar kinds of things, okay, by region. If you look down at the bottom there, this is kind of a different, I don't know if you've ever been introduced to this measurement, the DALI measurement, but it's showing you disability and the years of life basically lost to either premature death, other years of life that you're living with a disability, and this particular map is showing you those relative to climate change. And so in the Africa region and Southeast Asia region, see if I can use this without. So all sub-Saharan Africa means, you know, here's the desert, basically. Sub-Saharan Africa means all the countries that border that desert and south. And then here we have our Southeast Asia region have the most significantly high figures. Why? You know, you have poor people, maybe economically poor. You have people who aren't always having even their basic human needs met in these developing countries. But why will they suffer most? There's research over and over and over again saying that these countries are going to lose out in the process of climate change. And so here's some points to remember. One is that, yes, I talked about them being dependent on agriculture, but they're also dependent on fisheries, and many of them are dependent on tourism. There's a huge tourism market to some of these countries, a lot of them. I'll explain Belize in just a minute, but there's also countries in Africa that people travel to in droves for things like safaris, okay? Whereas the country itself doesn't offer a lot otherwise in terms of some kinds of tourism, but people go specifically to those countries to see that. Then the capacity, people, typically the human capital, that means education levels, technical skills, etc. Financial, that yes, there is rampant poverty, but the capacity of the country to both anticipate some kind of shock and then be able to respond to it in effective ways is much lower. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, and I apologize, I didn't check the date, but a few years ago there was a pretty significant earthquake. Of course, that's not climate related, but it does show a natural disaster in Chile. And yes, there was significant impact, and a lot of people were affected, but the death rate was nowhere near the death rate of the earthquake that hit Haiti, in terms of just percent of population. And part of that had to do with things like building codes and literally the physical security of people. And so these countries, if the building codes even exist, they're not enforced. And typically they aren't very, oftentimes they aren't very, what's the word? I wanted to say strong, building code strong, that's not too good. But anyhow, we'll go with it. Okay? So, let's highlight the blue. Vulnerability means lacking in financial, social, and political means. So it's not only economics. Okay? Social and political means. Social means when you have some kind of shock to the system, one of the first places that people go, if they're vulnerable and they don't have the economic means to go to the bank, get out their savings account, is to their social network, their family and their friends. And they ask for assistance. Hey, can you help me out? Hey, can I live here? Hey, could I live here, and can you help me out for a couple weeks until I get back on my feet? Okay? That's what the social part of this means. And there's places where people don't have that. And then the political means really is talking about empowerment. That there are developing countries, there's other kinds of countries too, where people are not participating in civic life. They do not have a voice, political voice. They do not feel like they have a voice. There may be subgroups of a population. One of the things that we look at is different generations within a population. We also look, a lot of research is done by gender. So if I had to sit here and say, what are three of the most common vulnerable groups in any developing country, my answer would be the elderly, women, and children under 5. And I'd be right, I'm guessing about 80% of the time. So my research specifically looks at how communities are resilient after a climate shock. I identified the most vulnerable people in communities, and then I'm trying to study them relative to those who are more secure. And what are the coping strategies? What are the responses that happen after a hurricane wipes out a community? How do people respond? And is it resilient? So these coping strategies are pretty important, right? And sometimes a climate disruption means that people, in the immediate aftermath at least, are doing things way out of their norm, okay? And whether that works or not, resilience itself is an idea that you can have. Resilience doesn't necessarily mean, it has a positive connotation, I think, right? If you're resilient, do you ever even use that word? She's resilient, or he's resilient. What does it mean? when you say that? What are you trying to say?
You can come back from bad things.
Come back from bad things,
All
right?
my general chemistry students are resilient.
After the test, after you get back to test. You know, I was thinking about that yesterday because right now I'm teaching a class of intro students. And I came back to the test, and the second test, everybody typically doesn't do as well as the first test. Because the second test is about human evolution. And all the different genuses and all the evolutionary record, and there's a lot of detail and a lot of dates and a lot of characteristics. And I warn them ahead of time. I give them tables. They still, you know. And so that day in class, I gave it back, and I swear I looked out in the sea of about this many kids, and they all hated me. I mean, I was just like, okay, should we have class? I literally said that. I said, should we have class, or do you guys just, you know, want to throw darts and arrows at me? I said, you hate that grade, I didn't, anyhow. But today, or yesterday, I taught yesterday that class, they loved me again. So I figured maybe they're a little resilient. Maybe they're coming back from that bad grade. Of course, I also curved it a little because I'm student-friendly mostly. Okay, Bangladesh, very quickly. I just have a couple slides on this, but I have worked here, and so, as I mentioned, has basically really bad predictions. Do we know where Bangladesh is? Over here. Where's my red dot? Okay. So this is India, kind of right here, and Bangladesh is to the east. The northern part, the northeastern coast of India is just to the east. It's actually a very small country. I guess you can't even read that. What's that say? Can you read that, anybody? It's a little blurry. Has extremely high population density, 2706 square mile, 2706 people per square mile. Okay, this economy is highly dependent. Roughly half the country right here is Delta region. It looks like it's just kind of down here, but it goes almost up to the capital, Dhaka. Okay, 45% of this population live below their poverty line. A third of land area floods annually. 30 million people, average of 1,000 fatalities a year, given the monsoons. Whoops. Let's just do this in the interest of time. So, what are the climate predictions? I told you it's one of the worst predictions. It is, quote unquote, a global hotspot for tropical cyclones and highly vulnerable to increased intensity of storms and droughts. 67%. So this is that coastal zone. I'm always a little scared. Are vulnerable to inundation. What are they doing? What are anthropologists doing to try to help whatever they're doing? Well, they are doing some physical infrastructure kind of work to help strengthen things like river embankments, building emergency shelters, etc. But they are also, with the help of anthropologists, I've been involved in what's here in blue, developing early warning systems that are culturally and socially appropriate. And I've actually been paid as a consultant to go into these regions and help villages practice. You know how we have, oh my gosh, you know, I might get a little brain dead this time, so I'm sorry. Fire drills, right? And we all have to practice going outside, and we hate that. Or I usually hate it. Or at Baylor now we have, I hate to say this, drills for some kind of mass shooting event. Do you guys have that? Yeah, so we have these big voice systems, and then we're all supposed to go hide in certain places and lockdown. We practice lockdown, which we never used to do, but that's another deal. So here, culturally and socially appropriate early warning systems, okay? So you can't, you would think that you could, but given the mindset, the worldview, how people think in different places in our world today, you cannot design, well, you can, but it probably won't be effective. It's best to design even something like an early warning system with that society's life way and how they think in mind. Okay? And there was a team of us who literally spent about 3 months going all over this Delta region practicing these early warning drills. Because while I said there was 1,000 people a year who die, in some years that's an average, it's much higher than that. And they've also put together, I won't go into the details here this evening, but a very different kind of financing mechanism. It's called the Bangladesh Climate Change Resilience Fund. You can see there in a relatively short period of time. That was established 2 years ago, US $170 million. From 7 development partners. They're mostly Western European countries to strengthen the resilience to climate change in this country. So you see that photo and you think, oh my gosh, because that's happening with much frequency. Even though that's a one-off disaster, their one-off disasters are chain events. And if you look at this picture, the picture itself, 10 years ago and today, vast improvements. Okay, so let's talk about Belize. Anybody been to Belize? Want to go? Cool tropical country. Second largest barrier reef in the world. Diving, snorkeling. As a sidebar, if anybody wants to become an anthropologist, one of our most basic research techniques is what we call participant observation. So you cannot understand what you're studying or working with unless you participate and do it. So I am now a certified diver. And I was never planned to be a certified diver. Yeah, okay. So what are my questions in this project? Who is vulnerable? In what ways? What are their coping strategies? Okay? Because the households, this project was done at the household level. The households that are more secure typically can come back easier, right? And how might climate change and vulnerability be affected actually by these coping strategies, if at all? Are they doing things that are actually influencing weather patterns, regional weather patterns? Could that at all happen? Okay. And so I know you haven't been there, but Belize is a very small country. It's roughly the size of Vermont or New Hampshire. It's a tropical country. It's biologically quite diverse. Okay? This map is actually showing you the protected areas of Belize. I know you can't read that key too much, but everything that's not sort of the khaki color is protected. And these things that are blue out here, this is a reef coming down here. It's the second largest, like I said. It's about 125 miles long. And it's in different places offshore. Some places it's only a quarter mile out, and some other places it's a little further. But these are all marine reserves. So they're protecting not all of the reef, but they're protecting a fair amount of the reef. And the dark blue are archaeological reserves. So there's a lot of Maya archaeological sites in Belize as well. Look, there's one right there. Ha! How would that be going on? Anyhow, so very extensive protected areas, conservation measures as a result. Some of that is being protected for tourism. So one of the things I want to mention here, the bullet point there, recent transition from agriculture to tourism. So this used to be an agricultural-based economy, and now it's a tourism-based, that's the dominant sector. It's not to say they don't grow any bananas or raise cattle or grow those oranges, citrus, some sugarcane in the north, but again, tourism is the highest earner. Highly ethnically diverse. 327,000 people. Okay, that's roughly the size of Waco. How big is Longview? Probably smaller. 80, okay. So 4 Longviews, right? Am I doing my math right? In a whole country, they get 8 million plus visitors a year. So they're inundated by all of us going there. Okay. But in that 327,000, there are 14 major ethnic groups, so a lot of diversity. Let me just mention that the Barrier Reef itself is larger than just up and down the coast of Belize. It also goes up to the Yucatan and down to Honduras. It has been recognized. It is part of the World Heritage Site System as of 1996. Stretches over 1,000 kilometers. Yeah, let's leave it at that for this. So here are some of the more recent weather events in Belize. The little red cyclone little things are major hurricanes. So this is going back quite a ways, 1965, just up to 2005. You can see there's some here. And then between, I don't have a graphic for it. It just hasn't been published. But between 2005 and 2015, 9 hurricanes have hit Belize. So in the last 10 years, 9 hurricanes, major hurricanes. This one, Iris, I happen to be working in one of the communities that I'm also working in for this one. Pre and post this hurricane, there was 95% loss of all structure. 95%. And then these green bars are showing you coral bleaching. So one of the concerns in Belize with climate change and the fact that they are tourism dependent, and the tourism is dependent on the reef, is that the reef is threatened. So if there continue to be coral bleaching events, and they occur more often, you're going to lose parts of that reef. And if it gets bad enough, divers, anybody a diver? Yeah. Divers versus snorkelers. You know, there's some things to be said there. I don't want to say anything bad about anybody. But divers are a little more sophisticated in what they want to experience than a snorkeler. And so if the condition of the reef is not good, those divers are going to go somewhere else. Would you agree? Or? Yeah. Let's just highlight right here. I don't know why I can't do this. 58% of reefs are in poor critical condition. Okay, this particular reef it's part of the World Heritage Site, but guess what? Now it's graduated to the list of World Heritage Sites in danger, 2009. And why is it in danger? It's in danger because of climate change and because of uncontrolled development. That's what it says. Okay, and then there's some other things going on. I mean, I've mentioned some of these, but the global economic crisis, you know, when you have a tourism-based economy and you have that kind of crisis, Belize was, you know, when you have an economy that's almost entirely dependent on a single sector, it causes you to be vulnerable if there's that kind of a crash. So here's Belize. Here's my 3 sites. They're all coastal sites. The one up here is actually on a key. It's a fairly long key, about 20 miles long. And so we worked in San Pedro, the town there. And this is actually the oldest tourist destination in Belize because the reef is right there. I mean, you can just see it's about a quarter mile out. Then we have Placencia. This is the one that was hit in 2001 by Hurricane Iris, just direct hit. And then we have Punta Gorda. This one is a more diversified economy. One of the reasons we chose these 3 was, one, the history, the oldest history and the newest history of tourism, so we're kind of getting some representation there. We also chose them relative to their ethnic composition, as well as the types of tourism that people can access that's not reef-based from these locations. So here you can go inland and do all kinds of stuff right here. I won't go into it, but there's a jaguar sanctuary. There's a community baboon sanctuary. There's up here. There's these Maya guest houses that you can visit, etc. And then this region is actually the interior ecotourism region. The country here at its widest point, Belize City, over 75 miles. However, by the main highway, which you see right here, 2.5 hours to drive 75 miles. So not, it's a little rugged. Here to here, 125 miles. That's a good 8-hour drive. Okay? So needs a little help with some infrastructure. All right. I think I said some of this, yeah. Okay, so how do I figure out how households are vulnerable? Well, there's a particular, I won't belabor this really, but there's a particular framework that's quite well accepted. It's used widely in developing countries. It's called the Household Livelihood Security / Vulnerability Framework. And it's looking at people's lives in all these different areas, okay? So there's 7 main areas, am I counting it right, that we look at. But in each one of these, there's a number of variables that we're collecting data on. In fact, the survey that we did on this project had 345 variables, okay? And for vulnerability, we isolated out about 30 variables. And I don't have time to go through the method there, but just to say that nutritional security, as an example, I'll give you an example. We are weighing and measuring children under 5 for height for age, weight for age, height for weight. And we're using the World Health Organization standards to determine what % of our households have children who are malnourished or undernourished. And that's the standard proxy indicator for whether a household is vulnerable or not. Okay? Under food, we're doing a diet diversity index and score as an example. Education is a little more obvious. We're looking at education levels and whether it's school enrollment rates. Whoa, I did it again, but I went the other way. Environmental security, we're looking at the extent that a household is dependent on a natural resources and then what the condition of those natural resources are. Okay? So those are, and I talked a little bit about social network security. So this isn't all the data, but this is just showing you some. The high, medium, low, and vulnerable. High, medium, and low are security. I should have put that word there. I'm so sorry. High security households, medium, and low security households. Okay? So the blues and the gray. So relative to economic, relative to economic security, you can see here that our % of households, roughly, I don't know what that is, 38% or so, have high economic security. They're secure. What I'm really looking at is who's vulnerable. That's this bar right here. So in our sample population, which we have collected data on 633 households between those 3 communities, roughly 54% are vulnerable in terms of economics. But look here, a really small percent, maybe 4 or 5, are vulnerable in terms of social networks. So they have friends and family, and of course we all kind of have friends and family, hopefully. But they are not afraid. They are involved in social networks. They are socially connected. And so that is a safety net for them in terms of a crisis. Food, they have food security. There's not that many that are food vulnerable. Look how many are secure. Health. Also, so really, and education's not too bad. So really the biggie is that, yes, my vulnerable households in the sample are economically poor, okay? But they're not socially poor. They actually have okay food security, which means they have at least a good basic diet, okay? Now this, I was trying to get this in different colors. My little program wouldn't allow me to do it, but these are the coping mechanisms that the research is asking for we were talking about the last 4 hurricanes that these communities had experienced, or tropical storms, okay? And the associated flooding and the associated mudslides. So everything that happened relative to those storms, the bars going across, again, the lightest bar in each category is showing you the vulnerable, okay? So that's what we're really looking at. So look at the vulnerable. What are they doing? They are going to church. They are asking, I know these are abbreviated, but they're asking family and friends for help. Okay? They're not somebody who says, we don't have any problems. Right? They're not even there. They have problems. But they are also helping others. Look at that. Helping others. They've had at least one, roughly 55%, have at least one person in their household who is out-migrated for work so that they can send money home. That's what remittances means. They have received food aid. They have gone and worked, like this means that they've worked outside their normal jobs for money. They're just doing whatever they can to get money. They have borrowed money. They have used savings as hardly there, 10% for the vulnerable, because mostly, guess what? They don't have savings, right? And they're not building and repairing too much. Remember, 95% structure loss in that one case. The vulnerable are not buying because they don't have money. And they don't have credit, etc. Now, our high security is, in some cases, kind of the flip side. Look at that. They have savings and they're using it. They are building and repairing because they can. They're also helping others. Everybody's kind of helping others, right? They're not having to borrow as much money. They're not having to just go out and get whatever job because they have savings. Almost all of this makes sense if you think about it, right? And they're the only ones that say they don't have any problems. Well, 10% of them said they don't have any problems. Each one of these is separate. I should mention that. That's why, like, for the high security, for each one of these categories, it's not adding up to 100 because these are separate responses, separate questions. So the big question is, and I'm going to run out of time, are these coping mechanisms leaning towards being resilient in positive ways? Okay? And I will tell you right now, and it's a little frustrating from my own background and perhaps yours, as suggested by the fact that you are attending a religious institution, that in the literature, for myself, let me go back and say, for myself, I think this is a resilient and good strategy. Going to church, I've said going to church, but really the entire response is that they're seeking a spiritual, not assistance, what's the word I use? Yeah, that's probably something like that. I'm sorry, the word's escaping me. But it includes going to church, but it's a little broader category, really, than that. It's stated. And so I'm thinking, okay, I don't know, my own personal interpretation is that's good. They're going to family, friends, they're helping others. That's all good. But if you look at the development literature in terms of how these developing countries should be responding to a shock like these, they're negging this. They're saying this is not good. Because they think that the basic human needs, food, shelter, potable water, health care, what's the other one? Education is one. Is where people should be focusing. They should all be down here, trying to get means, whether they're working for it or getting it or trying to get aid or using savings, to build and repair. This should be their primary focus, to have that shelter. And so some of these folks, some of my vulnerable population in these communities, because they're seeking solace, seeking spiritual contact, solace, it also had an emotional kind of variable to it, are not getting the food or the emergency aid because they're not down here trying to do this. So yours truly got a little upset and told some people. That's all I'll say about that. But so these are the most frequent responses. I don't think we need to do that. We collected data on resilience, but let me just say, because I'd rather have some time for questions, that these are the key elements that, from the social science realm and looking at human populations, not ecosystems, because the whole idea, the whole sort of concept of resilience originated out of ecology. Okay, and then anthropologists, other social scientists have tried to kind of borrow, some people would say steal, but we kind of tried to borrow the ideas and tried to figure out ways that we could use those concepts and how they're measuring things in ecology in terms of ecosystems coming back, like a forest after a fire. How can we translate that to people after a hurricane? And so these are there's something like 400 definitions of resilience for human populations. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with that, but these are the most common characteristics or traits. Okay, capacity for learning and adaptation. Okay, now adaptation does mean over the long term survival. Okay, capacity for learning. You know, in this case, these communities were documenting 4 hurricanes over 10 years. Was their coping responses after Hurricane 1 the same as after Hurricane 4? Did they learn over time what might be better, worse responses? The degree to which an adaptive system is capable of self-organization. So in this case, we're looking at households and we're looking at communities. And how did these communities respond collectively after an event? Okay, and I'll tell you that one community, the one in the middle, Placencia, even though their social network ratings were pretty high, after the one hurricane that destroyed everything, cats and dogs fighting all over everywhere. That's what these people were doing. I was amazed. There was one weekend I thought, I might need to get out of here. And the murder rate went up, crime rates soared. People were not working together. They were not organizing in a collective action type of way. So that particular hurricane, they kind of flunked that one. Okay, maintaining functions and feedbacks following stress. This is really what somebody mentioned, that we think of when we think of resilience. And so, are they able to come back? There's discussion that resilience really should mean, and I'm not sure I agree with this, should come back better. That if it's a learning process, that we don't want to just necessarily maintain functions. What if pre-shock, whatever the shock is, things weren't very good? Do you want to come back to that? So in some of these developing countries where things are really not good, do you want to be resilient to the degree where you're coming back to what it was before? Or do you want to use the shock as an opportunity to have it be better after? And that's resilience / development. Because development, in terms of these developing countries, really means improvement. However, those populations define improvement. That's what development means. I'm sitting here holding this. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all this because don't we want time for questions? Yeah. So I will show you that we derived a resiliency index. I think I mentioned a vulnerability index. We also devised a resilience index relative to those different main components of the livelihood, security, food, environmental health. This is part 1. These were the things we measured in terms of resilience. So food shortage, coping strategies, how good were those? Natural resource dependencies, weather impacts, coping strategies to the weather, coping due to illness. And we also, I don't have time to go into this, but we measured stress after an event. We measured it, we have questions and a survey about stress, and we also took different biomarkers, primarily blood pressure, but also hair cortisol samples that you can measure stress with. Here's some of the findings. We actually have, food security. 32% of households, though, at the bottom here, had a high stress level after at least one of the storms. Let me not do this. Here's the second part. So this deals more, obviously, with education and economics. Can't find my red light. There it is. Coping with children out of school, employment security, income surplus, incidence of savings, extent of savings. I mean, you could have savings, but it might be $20. Anybody in that boat? Or your extent of savings is probably a little more important, right, in these situations. And then empowerment, coping with crime, neighborhood cohesion. This is a measurement, again, of that social connectedness and whether people would go to their neighbors if they don't have family in their community. And so these are some of the things we found out. 28% of households have low employment security. Only 12% report any kind of surplus in their income. But after the hurricane, 64% were able to meet their basic expenses. Look at this one. 78% report they would turn to family. So that's a really good sign. And 50% participate in civic life. That's much higher than almost any other place I've ever worked in the world. So, the discussion and conclusions. There's not always a direct correlation. Vulnerable households could be resilient. The assumption is that vulnerable households or vulnerable populations will be the least resilient. And that's not always the case, but it depends on how you define resilience. So for me, that emotional response, that seeking a spiritual solace, whether it be church or something else, I feel is a positive response. Of course, I told you literature doesn't necessarily want to support that. Okay? But very vulnerable households have that response with a higher frequency than secure households. Okay? So, whoops. Oh, I did it again. So there's not always a direct correlation between those two, even though that's an assumption that many people make. Okay? Evidence indicates that some vulnerable households respond with strategies that work to strengthen their capacity. So they aren't just lost. Weakest resources from which to draw are actually capital assets. That kind of makes sense, and ability to secure any kind of financial assistance. Vulnerable, poor households, economically poor households, struggle in the aftermath of an event to secure any kind of credit or loans. Stronger resources evident in the areas of social and emotional arenas. And then I'll draw your attention to the blue. Local cooperation is important in protecting communities, if not more so than material aids, like emergency relief in terms of building. Takeaway message. It's really important to have empowerment of these marginal groups so that in the aftermath of an event, they have a voice. In belief, if you have a thatched roof home, you cannot get relief. You cannot get emergency relief. What kind of craziness is that? Resilience of communities, we found, does depend on the ability to act collectively. So even though we were studying largely at the household level, we realized that collectively that data is suggesting that the households who fare better in the aftermath are the ones who are using their social network safety nets. Adaptive capacity, which is kind of the longer term picture. If you have several shocks and you're having to be resilient after each one, adaptive capacity can be illuminated by examining the means of resource management and its effectiveness, efficiency, and legitimacy. When I say resource here, I don't mean only a natural resource, okay? I mean human resources as well. And I believe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
The aftermath of physics exam.
You beg.
Plan to do better next time.
And you beg for a curve. nerve,
Yeah.
right?
Questions for our speaker here?
What's the government like? The government's a big part of this whole
Yes,
process.
so
What's
the government, I,
like?
you know, I
Yeah.
spend any time on that, but the government does have plans for a climate change, response policy, okay? So they do now have a national climate change office. They have a climate change officer, and she is working with me, and I personally know her, to draft a climate change mitigation policy. The folks in the communities are not aware of that at all, because I've asked questions, you know, what do you know about? There is early warning systems in Belize as well that are actually quite effective. So in these coastal communities, you know, we all know, right, in today's world, we know when a hurricane is going to strike, typically 3 to 5 days ahead of time, maybe even longer. You can track it longer, but where it's actually going to for sure hit, you know, and so the early warning systems are there because of the tourism in all these coastal communities in particular. Belize has a forced evacuation of all tourists 3 days before a hurricane strikes. And people used to not abide by that when that law was first passed, but now they absolutely do. All the, you know, the hotels, the guest houses, all of them get every single tourist out of that country, basically. I've been there pre a hurricane and been in that airport trying to get out of there. It's their own choice, though, to leave or not. And many do not evacuate.
So the tourists don't all evacuate, but what do the people of Belize think when all the tourists have to get out? But then, I mean, they have.
I think they understand it now. I mean, the ones who are particularly in those coastal communities and they have tourism-based businesses, you know, they're going to lose business, right? They're going to lose, in some cases, they're going to lose income because they're not necessarily in jobs where they have any kind of insurance against the storm. But at the same time, they know that if there's some major storm that comes through and a whole lot of fatalities, you know, people get hurt, but then Belize gets a major black mark in terms of tourism. So it's a short-term loss, right, for the longer-term gain. And I will say that in general, the high tourist season in all of Central America is our spring season. And then summer is kind of a medium season, but the hurricane season itself is the low tourist season. So there's not, which is like July through October. So the number of people who are visiting these countries at that time is much lower. So the loss is also a little lower because it's their low season. And they sort of expect it to not be that busy. I have friends that own guest houses, etc. They actually shut down totally and do all their repairs and painting and all that stuff during the hurricane season. I think they see it as a necessary evil, right? Because you don't want your tourists to die, and then people don't come to Belize at all. Get a bad rep. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm not quite sure whether you say it, but when studying poverty, you showed us areas, I mean, different countries, excluding China.
Yeah.
So help me understand why China is was
China, during that time frame, that was a political move on the part of, I think that was a World Bank study. Okay, so either World Bank, and a lot of things were going on in China, and so I didn't, you know, I didn't derive that data at all. I just basically showed you what was researched. I'm not saying there's no poverty in China. That's what we're trying to do that.
Maybe it's because
There's
China's kind of an outlier with respect to their growth.
I mean, Yeah, and a lot was going on. That was, I think, a slide that was showing you up to 2005, you know, and so from like 1981, there was a lot going on. I'm guessing the World Bank, for perhaps political reasons, did not want to include the China data in that, just in that data, you know, in that. Yes?
When y'all go in, y'all do the studies. Do y'all help the people too? Do you
Okay,
help
so
them?
what I didn't talk about at all tonight is that we also do, once we finish our study, we do, part of this grant involved helping these communities improve their resilience to these shocks. And so we have done what we call scenario building, with focus groups, and a lot of, that is more of the applied work. We have to get this information first before we do that. But yes, that has also been done.
Okay.
With the government's blessing. Yeah, you can't do that without the government's blessing. Any other questions?
Oh, there was a lot of good parallels there, in building resilience to storm damage and test damage. You learn from what you did wrong, you build collaboration, you learn how to rely on each other, right? So that doesn't happen the same way the next time.
You know, closer to home, I just got back, I mentioned from my national meetings, within our national group, we have a natural disaster and risk subgroup. There's a resilience subgroup. You know, there's all these different subgroups, but the natural disaster and risk subgroup, I think there were like, or the 2 years or so after Katrina, at our meetings, and there's roughly 2,000 anthropologists on one place for these meetings, there were over 20 sessions on Katrina itself. And each session has something like, usually 6 or 8 papers. So there's a lot of research and a lot of applied work being done by anthropologists in Katrina that was very similar to this, in terms of looking at how people responded, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, we heard a lot about some of that in the press, right? But to actually document it systematically, and then a lot of those studies, that information is given to FEMA to hopefully do it better next time.
Wasn't the evacuations from New Orleans
Yes.
a lot better now than they did back in?
Even Houston now has an evacuation plan, and my husband works in Houston, that they didn't have in, I think it was Rita. So Houston and Waco are 3 hours apart. When, I think it was Rita, was coming to Houston, everybody were scared to death and wanted to get out of Houston. It took him over 24 hours to get to Waco. And most of that was trying to get out of Houston. Now, not now, but when I hit, I can't remember the years, but there was a couple years in between, 2 or 3 years in between Rita and I. It took him roughly 8 hours. So between 24 and 8 hours. And now, when you go to Houston, I don't know if anybody goes to Houston, but there's evacuation signs all over. And I assume they now have worked traffic lights and all that, where you're not just sitting there screaming at each other, trying to get out. It's an awful feeling, right? And that congested of a place. Yeah.
So we'll change the name of the Student Achievement Center to the Student Resilience. Yeah.
That's a good idea. I might have to remember that.
The last question here from a large audience, and we'll let you come down and ask another question. One that a last big question here.
Yes.
NOAA just recently started advertising a research study where they deduced that the Earth is now wobbling
Yeah, I saw that.
because of water displacement.
Yeah.
What do you think they're even
I
going to go
posted
with
that
that?
little story on my Facebook. I just kind of read through it. I talked to a couple environmental scientists at Baylor, trying to get a feel for that because it's a little out of my range. And they said it's absolutely, they think it's absolutely sound reasoning and sound data. Yeah, I saw that exact, yeah. I don't feel like I have the background to say whether that's true or not. I was sure my father was a physicist. He could answer that for us, but
So you haven't heard anything in the community about what
Yeah.
they're thinking about that?
Okay, well, I think we'll be around for a few minutes if you want to stick around and ask her more questions.
Thank you for
Otherwise,
coming.
let's thank our speaker.
I'm sorry, that was a little long. I think I